Welcome back to 4 for 4's The Most Accurate Podcast. As always, on Thursday, I'm your host, John Daigle, joined today by some very good friends in life because with all the chaos happening in the NFL, basically on an every 24-hour basis, I couldn't do this alone. So first up, I had to call on good friend and now CEO of his own company, essentially, JJ Zachariason, late-round quarterback himself. JJ, how's everything been going behind the scenes for you?
Good, man. Good. It's good to talk to you. Good to see both your beautiful faces. Haven't seen you guys in a minute. Ready to talk about this stuff because it has been probably the wildest 2 weeks of probably any of our careers with this stuff in terms of movement in the NFL and all that. So yeah, I'm excited to hear your takes. Excited to talk about it.
You mentioned the other person, and that is none other than Ryan McDowell of DynastyLeagueFootball.com himself, who is also just trapped right now, buried in work, since he's updating for Dynasty League rankings and the free agent tracker to mention everything Dynasty-wise ongoing right now at the site. Ryan, how's everything going for you?
Oh my gosh. It's been wild. It's been wild. It's been fun. I was trying to think yesterday of all these players that have been traded. How many years do we have to go back to equal just what we've seen really in the past 2 or 3 weeks, right? I mean, we're talking about the past several years just to match the when you're talking about name recognition, big names being dealt. So yeah, it's a fun time for us for sure.
I came into fantasy conscious around, I think it was like David Carr's first year, whenever the Texans launched in his expansion team. And dating back to just then, maybe it was before then even, since we have a lot of friends that go even further back, but that's actually I can't recall a crazier offseason, as you mentioned, JJ, than this one dating back to then. Do you go before that working in or just playing fantasy? And can you recall literally as much chaos going on as there has been in the past 2 weeks?
I can't remember a single season like this. I think a lot of it is part of me thinks that it's this trickle effect of what we've seen happen in the NBA and other organizations where players understand leverage a little bit. And I think we're seeing that leverage obviously take place, whether it's at the quarterback position and we see the domino effect with a guy like Deshaun Watson, or what we're seeing with someone like Davante Adams, who just wanted a better deal, understandably so. Wanted to get a deal, didn't want to be franchised. And he's like, well, look, I would love to go to the Raiders and be with my buddy Derek. And so, he was able to have that leverage. And then Tyreek Hill, it's the same situation where he sees Davante Adams deal. I think the Chiefs might've been able to retain Tyreek Hill if not for the Davante Adams deal. And so you're just seeing player leverage really, at play here.
Yeah, and if not for the Christian Kirk deal, right?
That Christian Kirk deal. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, that overpay is really, I think, what kicked this off, because we've had the Hill trade, we've had the Adams trade. I mean, DJ Moore. I know we all love DJ Moore, but DJ Moore's getting $20+ million a year now.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's been pretty crazy. Yeah, I think it was Field Yates yesterday that had a tweet that said this might be the Cincinnati Bengals effect, that every other team saw the Bengals go from losing record, second overall pick, wherever they were a year ago, to Super Bowl, to the Super Bowl runner up, I guess. And yeah, so every other team feels like they can do that turnaround and follow that roadmap as well.
As Evan Silva also mentioned, it's the Les Snead effect, since it's a copycat league. Mm-hmm. And the F them picks motion has now been seen by everyone as a Super Bowl approach, and thus everyone now is just giving away their first rounders. And that's actually where I want to start, because Tyreek Hill's dynasty value was obviously impacted following the trade to Miami. Prior to that deal, he was ranked number 6 overall at DynastyLeagueFootball.com and one quarterback dynasty leagues. He was the wide receiver 4 and your latest March Dynasty ADP, actually. And among Superflex rankings was the number 15 overall player, including number 5 at his position. So I want to start with you, Ryan, and just ask, what do you think happens now? The fact that he is moving to a offense that has more talented mouths to feed than just himself and Travis Kelce like he had prior.
Well, I think what we're seeing, and we've kind of lumped Tyreek and Adams together, and I think that works still with this, because they're both going to a situation where they're seeing a quarterback downgrade. But also at their age, we were already seeing their value slightly decline this offseason anyway, their dynasty value, because that's just what happens to 28, 29, 30-year-old wide receivers. We see those dips every offseason. So, how much of that is going to continue with the trade? How much of that would have happened anyway? I think ultimately that makes both of those guys closer to a buy than a sell for me in Dynasty. Not because I am confident in their situation, but just because I expect their value to bounce back once we're seeing these guys on the field.
And how are you handling the spin, JJ?
Yeah, I think that's the right take. These guys in particular, like the Adams, Tyreek tier, are obviously going to be team dependent, dynasty team dependent. If you are looking to win and you're ready to go for it, then it makes sense to buy into a guy like Hill right now, where his value could hypothetically not be that much lower. I think that he, as number one, as poor of a situation as this might look on paper, which it could be worse. We all know that it could be a lot worse, but he is stepping into a situation where, they don't have like these, aside from Waddle, there's no like locked in three that we should be really, really concerned about. He's also walking into a situation where we have to hope, at least, and I think that we can feel fairly confident that Mike McDaniel is going to put him in an opportunity to do well. I think that there's a lot of question marks with the fit from a Tua standpoint, and I understand those concerns to some degree. But I think that Tua, the reason they went and got Jaylen Waddle, this is my take, at least in draft season last year, the reason they went and got Jaylen Waddle is because Tua is not a guy who throws to guys who don't get any separation. Like, that's why there was no real rapport there with him and Devontae Parker. So they get a guy who separates incredibly well, and Jaylen Waddle can stretch the field. It made a ton of sense. Just that year one, they utilized him in a slightly different way and just fed him the ball close to the line of scrimmage, because it's all they could really do. They had a bad offensive line. They're not able to really allow Jaylen Waddle to run the full route tree, just because he was the only dude in that offense, and they can't really do that much with that. There's not that much versatility there. You add Tyreek Hill, you're getting another player who can create a lot of separation for a guy like Tua, who is going to throw into that kind of to that kind of player, as opposed to throwing into tight windows. And so, yeah, you can look at like what he's done over the last couple of years. Last season, Tua had a 15 plus air yard rate of under 13%, when the league average was about 16.5 to 17%. So he was below average at throwing it deep. His completion rate was above average on those throws, so that's good to see. So I think that what we're going to see is a little bit more frequency there, because you have Tyreek Hill on your team now. And then hopefully a guy like Mike McDaniel can utilize Tyreek Hill. And, let's not just assume that he is Deebo Samuel, number one. Like let's not assume that he's just going to be Deebo, who can create, who can break tackles like we really haven't seen from that position before. But I do think that we're going to see him lined up in the backfield and have these unique formations and situations for Tyreek Hill. And so there is some reason to be bullish on this landing spot, as opposed to some other landing spots that are out there. Like, it could have been way, way worse, despite the fact that he is going from Patrick Mahomes, to another offense.
It's a double-edged sword for me, Ryan, because on one hand, we do have the evidence of him playing with Alex Smith, who we compare much more similarly to Tua than we would Patrick Mahomes, of course. And you can say, okay, well, Tyreek Hill on limited volume was the 15th and 5th wide receiver in fantasy points per game from Alex Smith. So that's okay. But on the other hand, we finally did get that volume the past two seasons. From week 9 of the 2020 season, he's been pelted with 9.9 targets per game as a volume hoss. And thus he's been delivering not only his explosiveness, but now this explosiveness with significant volume. And so really what I'm questioning is, does that 6 years of difference matter, right? Or 4 to 5? Does that the time he was even more explosive and fresher legs with Alex Smith, will that transition to now being with Tua? Is he as fast? Because if he is going to see limited volume, more carries, like JJ said, but limited volume, can he still translate that limited volume to the same fantasy points and efficiency that he did earlier in his career?
I mean, I have concerns about that, certainly. And I think there's a lot of unknowns with this situation. Obviously the newness for Tyreek Hill, but the newness for Mike McDaniel as well. And then just our continued uncertainty about about Tua as a quarterback. So for me, this is one of those that it's almost going to be a wait and see situation, kind of who wins out. Like, we trust Mike McDaniel, but we're uneasy about Tua. I think right now I'm leaning towards trusting the offensive scheme of Mike McDaniel and just honestly the talent of both Waddle and Tyreek Hill. So whether it's what we saw, the type of usage we saw with Alex Smith, I don't know if we'll get that, or I mean, really what we need obviously is just Tua to increase those deep balls. I mean, JJ mentioned some of it. He had 29 attempts all of last year of 20 plus passing or 20 plus yards. Yeah, that's not going to cut it. Tyreek had, I believe, 28 targets just by himself.
With this Tyreek deal, of course, other players are affected in the nature of it. And that means Jaylen Waddle now, who Mike McDaniel has already declared his love for, perhaps as the wide back usage player, suddenly has competition for that type of usage. At least we assume so. So what are you doing with Jaylen Waddle now in Dynasty leagues, JJ?
You know, the way that I always view Dynasty, and this is something that, you know, Ryan's talked about for years and years, but it's to look at things in sort of this, like, these two categories, these two constant parallels, where one bucket would be just straight up production, right? Like, you need your players to produce at some point, but the other bucket just being market value and just understanding how players will change and the volatility of market value. And the thing with Jaylen Waddle is, yeah, did his projection take a hit with Tyreek Hill being there? Yeah, I would also argue that we should have been projecting some sort of hit from Jaylen Waddle anyway, just because they were going to add something to this team. It would only be logical and make sense to do that. Obviously, we weren't expecting a talent like Tyreek Hill to step in, but even still, you know, two guys can be totally fine in an offense these days. You know, and seeing a 25%, like, both guys could see 25% target shares and we wouldn't even blink. So, you know, from a projection standpoint, yes, it does hurt Waddle. But it's not the end of the world for Waddle. And then, so what I then go to is look at the market value stance, and Waddle's a second-year guy who's coming off one of the most historic and best rookie seasons that we've seen, especially from a volume standpoint, a reception standpoint. The chance that, or the odds that Jaylen Waddle drops dramatically in market value year over year here is not that big. I mean, it's similar to how I would view a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, where they're going to add more pieces to that Lions offense. Maybe they already did with DJ Chark. Maybe they add someone through the draft. But you also have to keep in mind that a guy like St. Brown, and what we've seen historically, is young players who produce well as rookies. They generally don't see massive drops in ADP year over year. So you're going to at least retain the market value. So let's say that Jaylen Waddle stinks it up this year, which I don't think is going to happen. But let's just say that he's terrible this year. You're still going to have some value out of Jaylen Waddle entering next season, which is why, you know, I think, again, if this is a situation where someone's really low on Waddle now, it's pretty easy to buy into him just because you know that market value is going to stay consistent.
Yeah, I kind of, and I shouldn't just say we all kind of saw this coming with Jaylen Waddle, right? And almost every year you've got that rookie who produces, especially in the back half of the season, and we see a major value jump. I had to look back, but on December 1st, and we do mock drafts year round at DLF to collect ADP. So on December 1st, Jaylen Waddle was the wide receiver 28 in Dynasty. Now he's wide receiver 7. So, you know, that jump has already been there. As soon as that news hit yesterday, I love to kind of check the pulse of the Dynasty community. I threw up a Twitter poll, just Tyreek versus Waddle. Who do you want in Dynasty? And it was 63-37 in favor of Waddle. So we haven't seen Waddle ahead of Tyreek in our rankings, in ADP. Obviously, they've been trending two different directions. Waddle moving very quickly, and Tyreek kind of that slow leak due to what I was mentioning earlier, just the age and the offseason and those trends we always see. So I was shocked at those results. Certainly, I don't think we have to worry about Waddle from a value standpoint. As JJ mentioned, production, those are kind of two separate conversations. I think lately my comp for Waddle is kind of a weird one. It's Antonio Gibson, because Gibson comes into the league and we know he has this skill that he's borderline elite at, catching the ball out of the backfield. And then in year one, he doesn't really get to do that. In year two, we start valuing him highly because we think he probably will get to do that. And he really doesn't. And now with Waddle, that skill is the deep ball, the big play. Didn't really do that as a rookie. We start moving him up. We see those glimpses. We start valuing him like a dynasty wide receiver one. And now here comes Tyreek Hill. And we're starting to think maybe maybe Waddle's not going to get that chance at as many deep passes in 2022 either. So I kind of see a little parallel between those two young players.
Hill's departure also leaves a vacancy and an ambiguous situation, honestly, in Kansas City. I track, for example, the vacated targets from last season's production for every position and team at 4for4 Football. And it's a fun tool to use for content specifically because I can give that data to 5 different analysts, sharpest minds in football, and I'll get 5 different answers. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to take these targets. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who just signed a 3-year deal for $30 million. Also, Travis Kelce, perhaps Mecole Hardman. Someone will say these targets go somewhere. And so I want to start with you, JJ, and ask, is there a winner in this deal in Kansas City or perhaps a loser? And is this a situation in Dynasty where if you do think someone wins, are you trying to buy low in that offense right now?
I'm kind of not trying to buy low, and here's why. So entering this offseason, I really like Juju. Like I as a buy candidate, I was pretty into Juju. Young guy who maybe he didn't have a wide receiver one ceiling anymore. I mean, we have seen him in the past be a wide receiver one, and at least have that from a market value standpoint. I think that the market corrected itself, and that's not the expectation anymore. But the problem is with Kansas City right now is they don't really have anyone on the perimeter, and that's an issue. I mean, they need someone to be able to play on the outside. You have Travis Kelce playing tight end, obviously, and taking away targets there. But Juju Smith-Schuster has become a very, very good slot receiver. I mean, he can play on the outside, sort of, but he's a much better and well equipped to be a slot guy. And I'm hoping that Kansas City is going to utilize him that way, and he can generate a lot of yak, etc. But that also likely caps his ceiling a little bit. And I think that a lot of people, right now are just seeing this as a huge, huge win for Juju, which it is a win for Juju overall. But from a market value standpoint, I can actually make the argument that Juju has gone from being a buy to now being a sell in the Kansas City offense from a dynasty standpoint, just because he's not a guy that's going to be this wideout that moves all over the field and is able to take over games. He's a slot guy, good red zone threat. Again, very, very good after the catch. But they are, they just got Marquez Valdes-Scantling to play the perimeter and stretch the field a little bit. They're going to get someone in the draft. I mean, you have to assume that they're going to use one of those picks. And, the draft is interesting because there's a lot of wide receiver needy teams. I think there's going to be a lot of wide receivers who we expect to be second round guys that might squeak into the late first now because of what's going on there. Hopefully they'll be able to add someone, a true perimeter guy, maybe an X in the draft. But I think they're going to at least address the position in the draft. And so from a dynasty standpoint, yes, everything looks butterflies and rainbows for Juju right now. But he's just not that. We just have to be realistic about what Juju Smith-Schuster is. And he's a very, very good player. And he's one of the best slot guys in the league, given he's a very different kind of slot guy. And he can be a wide receiver too, realistically in the short term. But I think that we have to be realistic about ceiling. I don't know if that ceiling is quite there, even with Patrick Mahomes throwing him the ball.
Juju's ADP, I imagine, Ryan, has moved significantly in the last week alone because, remember, he signed his deal before Tyreek Hill, before we knew that deal was even going down. And so now to think he steps up as perhaps their number one, I'm curious to get your thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always chase those Kansas City players. But, I mean, Andy Reid traditionally doesn't get production from his wide receiver two. In his entire coaching career with Philadelphia and Kansas City, he's had one wide receiver two, one second fantasy wide receiver rank in the top 30 for the season. So we've done this for years, right? We've chased Mecole Hardman and Sammy Watkins, and we're doing the same now with Juju. And ultimately it doesn't bear a lot of fruit. So, but at the same time, what JJ said about Juju is obviously spot on. We don't really want him to be the top target in an offense. So them spending one of those picks on a wide receiver late in the first, I think would be a good thing for Smith-Schuster. And I mean, it just feels like every dynasty player came to the same conclusion yesterday that we should sell Juju Smith-Schuster. And we all know that when that's the case, that's that's not really going to work very well. So, I mean, checking out the trade finder at DLF, and these are not necessarily updated for yesterday's news. It's just as these trades are made across actual dynasty leagues, the price is just not there for Juju. You know, Juju for 2 seconds, Juju and a second for Beckham and Landry. I mean, these are kind of the going rates even after the Chiefs signing with the Chiefs.
In that graveyard of slot receivers from Kansas City you mentioned, you forgot to mention the chasing the dragon of Cornell Powell. I stuck that needle in my arm a couple times in the second round of dynasty leagues last year, and did not go well at all. I want to continue this trend for one more question before we move on to prospect talk and discuss Steelers wide receiver fallout, because it's no secret the Steelers have been in on a quarterback in this draft. They told the world they were interested in Najee Harris last year, got him. They told the world they were interested in Pat Freiermuth, they got him. And so now all we hear is either Malik Willis, Kenny Pickett, just a quarterback in general. The Steelers are feasting on and meeting with constantly at pro days, even though they just signed Mitchell Trubisky. So I'm curious, JJ, how are you handling Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool in dynasty leagues right now, knowing it could be one or the other? And you could possibly even have two answers since we're not sure yet.
Yeah. So here's the thing. And I actually did a deal yesterday that involved both these guys. And so, I have it fresh in my mind of like what I was thinking with it. I'm actually more on the sell Claypool, be okay with holding Johnson side right now, because we've seen Deontay Johnson be a monster consistently. Like we've seen Deontay Johnson warrant getting a lot of looks, being a focal point in offense and being the number one guy in his offense. And he's dominated. He's a very, very good wide receiver. We don't know for sure yet with Chase Claypool. It's kind of been all over the place. I think that the fantasy community might like Claypool a little bit more than like the NFL does. And that's an issue. But then the other point to this too with Pittsburgh is they have no wide receivers outside of those two right now. I mean, they lost Juju Smith-Schuster, they lost James Washington, they lost Ray McCloud. Not that Ray McCloud was anything that we should be worried about, but they have no depth at wide receiver right now, which tells me that they're going to do the typical Steeler thing and probably use a day 2 pick on a wide receiver. And that wide receiver is probably going to end up being pretty good. And just because of how strong they've evaluated the position over the last decade and a half. And so, they've had misses in there like Limas Swede and such, but they've done a very good job of picking out these wide receivers seemingly out of nowhere sometimes, like a Deontay, even a Chase Claypool, where we're like, that's a weird pick, and then they end up panning out. So I think there's a lot of volatility right now with Chase Claypool in particular, where we don't know if he's it. We don't know if he's really that guy. But then on top of that, you're adding a layer of what if the guy that comes in a fairly deep wide receiver class, what if a guy comes in and is just as talented, if not more, then all of a sudden, you're looking at a similar situation that he's been in, with Juju there. And that becomes an issue. And so that's sort of how I'm viewing Claypool. I think Deontay is safe enough just because he's shown us that he's very good. Good wide receivers generally will be able to retain market value and such. And then, from a quarterback standpoint, I'm expecting, I look at what the Steelers are doing versus what like Carolina did last year, right? The difference being that Carolina went out and they traded for Sam Darnold, gave up capital, and also exercised that 5th-year option, had to pay him a lot more money. Whereas Mitch Trubisky, very incentive-based deal. It's not that big. It's not like they're locked into Trubisky, but he's going to get an opportunity. And so I hope that for the Steelers' sake and for Steelers fans and for anyone who has one of these wideouts in Dynasty, I hope that Mitch Trubisky does not stop them from getting a quarterback if they like that quarterback. I think that's what my greater point with the position is for Pittsburgh, because last year Sam Darnold did stop the Panthers from getting Justin Fields. I mean, that was part of their equation, right? And I think from a process standpoint, that's just a big mistake. Even if Justin Fields doesn't pan out, like we don't know yet if Justin Fields is that dude, but from a process standpoint, I think it makes sense to throw as many darts as you can at the position. And so I'm hoping that Trubisky, I'm hoping that at the end of the day, Pittsburgh has 2 quarterbacks where they're like, oh, what do we do with these guys? Because they're both pretty good and they both have value. And I think that the Steelers might be thinking that way, which is why we're seeing them tied to so many quarterbacks. So it wouldn't shock me at all if they trade up or if one of these guys falls to them that they feel good about and they go that direction in round 1.
I also keep going back to last preseason, Ryan, when Steelers quarterbacks under Matt Canada ran play action on 20% of their dropbacks, led the preseason in pre-snap motion. And then in the regular season, when Ben Roethlisberger gets his first snap, they nixed that identity completely, only to see Roethlisberger eventually lead the league in quickest time from snap to throw, leaving zero time for plays to develop downfield. On that same note, though, like JJ said, obviously talent earns targets, right? You have to still earn your targets. Like you mentioned, look at all the Chiefs receivers who have not earned targets despite playing with the best quarterback in the league. And so that's why I keep going back to Chase Claypool's raw talent, but also Deontay Johnson is the dude who's already done this.
Yeah, Deontay is definitely the one I want, and that's the case whether it's Mitch Trubisky, who I'm actually kind of excited to see Trubisky outside of the Bears, right, and outside of that offensive system, and honestly with just way more weapons than he ever had in Chicago, and it's not even factoring in the ability to run and do some different things in that offense than we saw last year, but. I mean, when it comes down to it, I think it might be this simple. Chase Claypool has 2 wide receiver 1 games in his career. Two times he's been a top 12 wide receiver. We know one of those was that, 4 touchdown game, I believe, in his rookie season. It would be crazy to check the percentage of his total fantasy stats over his 2-year career that came from that one game. It's probably way too high. I like Claypool. I'm still kind of interested in him. The price has obviously dropped. But I mean, Deontay is not only a wide receiver 1 for me, he's a top 12 overall player. So if I've got a late first round pick in a startup, he's a guy I would be looking at.
Claypool carries inside the 10 also frustratingly didn't stick. Like Joe Mixon targets last year, essentially. Would have been nice for them to be a weekly constant, but was not the case. Anyways, though, before we get on to prospect talk, I actually want to remind everyone very quickly that the best deal in the industry, literally the best, is back. Because right now, if you sign up for Underdog as a new subscriber, that's important, new subscriber, not only will you receive a free Pro 444 subscription with your access to all our ongoing redraft content and Discord access where you can bother me in the DMs, but Underdog will also match your deposit up to $100 by 100%, literally mirror the deposit. So just download the Underdog app, use the promo code 444. That's important when making your first deposit. And bingo, you're now part of our family. You can talk to us all the time in the Discord. Moving on, though, to prospects. Daniel Jeremiah's most recent mock included 7 wide receivers falling to 6 different teams: the Falcons, the Jets, Patriots, Cardinals, Packers, and Chiefs on night 1, which is why I think it's important we've all gathered here to talk about who could possibly fall on night 1. And so, JJ, I'm curious, is there a Jamar Chase situation at the top of drafts, like a player with immense talent that if you fell into elite opportunity like Chase did with the Bengals, for instance, playing with Patrick Mahomes with no competition at that position, or a Falcons quarterback with just Kyle Pitts to worry about at tight end, that would land him inside, I don't know, the top 12 rankings of wide receiver dynasty leagues? Or does that player just not exist in this draft?
I don't think the player exists in this draft. I don't mind the top of this draft, but I do think that this is a flatter draft in general than what we've seen over the last couple of years. Last year you had the big 3 at wide receiver, Jamar Chase in his own tier for the most part for people, but you had Jaylen, Waddle and Devontae Smith there too. And then you had that big cluster of guys where some of them hit, some of them didn't, whatever. I kind of feel like this class is likely deeper. Like if you were to look at the wide receiver, like 12 to 15 in this class versus like last year's, you'd probably feel better about this year's class with those kinds of guys. I mean, there's a lot of upside and potential with those players. They all have red flags, of course, but there's at least more there. Whereas this year, I understand why a lot of the first round wide receivers that are being projected to go in the first round are being projected to go in the first round, but I don't see a very clear cut top guy. And even like my top tier, for instance, has Garrett Wilson, Treylon Burks, and Drake London, like most people. But even still, like the next tier, when you get into like Jameson Williams and Chris Olave, I don't think they're that far from that top tier. Like, I don't think it's like this drastic difference and this big drop off where, you absolutely need to get in the top 3 of your rookie draft to be able to get one of those wide receivers because there's this big fall off. I think that what you're going to find is a lot of, especially in like a super flex league, you're going to find that a lot of late first, early second round picks are going to be very close to the same value as like a 104, 105 in rookie drafts this year. And so, no, I would say, to answer your question pretty directly, I don't think there's a Jamar Chase in this class. There's no one that really stacks up to him analytically either. There are guys that I like a lot. Don't get me wrong. I like Garrett Wilson. I like parts of Treylon Burks and Drake London. I think there's a lot there. I just highly doubt we're going to see something like Jamar Chase and what we saw with him last year.
What are your thoughts at the top, Ryan? Because what makes them even more shuffleable, to JJ's point, is that even when you look at expert mocks, we've seen Chris Olave, who's not even in JJ's first tier, mocked sometimes to number 8 overall. The first wide receiver at the board is the Falcons. And so when discussing draft capital, that also throws a wrench into the mix.
Yeah, I think most people have one of those three that JJ mentioned, London, Wilson, Burks, as their top guy, or probably their top 3 in some order. But you're right. When you look at NFL mock drafts, sometimes it's Olave, sometimes it's Jameson Williams, still pretty high up there. So yeah, he's spot on that it is flat. Not only is there not a Jamar Chase, though, I don't know that there's a situation like Cincinnati was. I mean, and unless we think Zach Wilson is making that Burrow leap, they've got 4 and 10. You look at the top 10 or 12 picks, and it's not really there, right? Even if it's Atlanta, obviously there's no quarterback there that's supporting that type of rookie production.
Is there someone you would consider a good wide receiver whose landing spot would actually affect your view on them? I think Rashad Bateman is the most recent example, who I loved pre-draft, but then also went into the draft thinking whoever Baltimore drafted, because they were very clearly grabbing a wide receiver, was going to be my sacrificial lamb for redraft leagues. And I was just not going to pick them whatsoever. Is there that kind of player, that kind of landing spot for you?
Well, landing spot matters maybe more than ever with this group, because we do have 5 wide receivers that, throw them in a bucket and pick one out, right? Mm-hmm. And now we have these 2 teams that we love and that we want to chase their players, being Green Bay and Kansas City. They both have multiple picks in the first round. We are pretty certain they're both going to draft a wide receiver with at least one of those picks. And whoever that is, I mean, maybe it is Olave falling. Maybe it's Jameson Williams with an injury discount. Maybe it's Jahan Dotson higher than some people think. Whoever it is getting a value bump for sure.
What about you, JJ?
Yeah, I agree. Like I see a scenario where Chris Olave is my wide receiver 4 in this class. And I see a scenario very easily where if he goes to Green Bay, if he somehow falls to Kansas City, or if they trade up or something, I mean, are we going to be shocked if he's the wide receiver 1 in this class from an ADP standpoint? I don't think that would be shocking at all, because again, the discrepancy between some of these top guys or quote top guys to a guy like Olave or to a Jameson Williams, it's really not dramatic. Like we just there's not a very clear gap. There is a gap because there, at least from like what my model says, but part of that is also projected draft capital, and the projected draft capital, whenever I inputted this stuff, is favored those 3. But again, over the last week or 2, I've seen a lot of shifting in mocks. And so it wouldn't be surprising if a guy like Olave gets elevated, or a guy like Jameson Williams gets elevated, or, if a guy like George Pickens ends up getting a first round draft capital. I mean, like, there's a lot of directions the wide receiver position can go in. And I think all that means is that there's going to be a lot of volatility, within the ADP market from a rookie draft standpoint. So I wouldn't be shocked at all if one of those guys goes to Kansas City or Green Bay, if they end up being, jumping a tier and just becoming the wide receiver 1 in this class, because there really are so many question marks as to who is the wide receiver 1.
Is there someone that stands out on the other end of that volatility? For instance, someone you were actually down on initially, but now it seems like the NFL is higher on them. Thus, their draft capital is now forcing them like even higher in your rankings and model.
I would say that it's probably the opposite more than anything. Like, it's probably that there are guys that I was high on that I thought looked really, really good, but then I just dig more and more into their profiles, and I look at where they're being mocked, and I just look more into it, and I'm like, well, I'm not as bullish as I thought I was. I mean, Treylon Burks is a really good example of that, where initially we're like, oh, this guy's going to be the next AJ Brown, and he has a flawless profile and all this, but it's not really the case. I mean, there's a very real chance that he's the next N'Keal Harry, right? Like there's a wide range of outcomes for these guys. Whereas, last season we felt pretty good about Jamar Chase. We felt pretty good about Devontae Smith, even Jaylen Waddle, who didn't analytically line up with a lot of models in the way that people look at this stuff. You could look at his small sample sizes, especially what he did before he got injured, his final season there, and do a little bit of projecting and be like, okay, this guy's going to be very good too. Whereas I just feel like this is sort of going the opposite direction, where a lot of the second round guys are getting elevated right now, like a Sky Moore, right? Sky Moore went from, in January, when I really started digging into this stuff, Sky Moore was like barely a top 100 pick from a projection standpoint. And now people are talking about him maybe squeaking into the first round, especially now that you have Kansas City and Green Bay there with multiple picks, as Ryan noted. So it's more so that things are converging as opposed to, guys that I was semi high on and they're getting elevated even more because of where they're being mocked to and such. I just think that they're just becoming this like giant pool of wide receivers where, from like 1 to 8, 1 to 9, I mean, there's just a lot of good talent, but not necessarily elite talent there. And it can just go in a lot of different directions.
Did you have the same experience when diving in, Ryan?
Yeah, I think Sky Moore is a great call there because we have seen that. We've seen that ascension of him, and it feels like the fantasy community, the dynasty community, is a lot more accepting of that early on this year. Like in most cases, we wait until the NFL draft happens. This player that maybe we didn't know who he was 6 months ago, or we thought he'd be a day 3 pick. He's drafted in the second round. Then we start adjusting. I think feels like we're trying to do that earlier this year. Sky Moore, Christian Watson, obviously the top 2 examples. I like Jaylen Tolbert as well. I think he could be a day 2 guy. So whether it's the flatness at the top of this wide receiver tier that's impacting that, or if it's just trying to learn lessons from previous years, I'm not sure, but it's been interesting, I think.
As Diego Lopez notes in the chat, the last thing we need is more Moores in fantasy to sort through. It's going to make the CSVs we all have just an absolute nightmare. JJ, given everything you said then, it doesn't sound like, and correct me if I'm wrong, you really want the number 1 overall pick in rookie drafts post NFL draft. Like, is this a situation where you're actually trying to trade down and accept the risk, the volatility, or are you clear cut in on someone at the top, at least of rookie drafts?
At the top of rookie drafts, I'm really cool with Breece Hall.
Okay.
I would be like, I think that we do finally, he emerged as like the clear cut 101, even like pre-draft at least, and where we're at now, even in super flex leagues, you can make the argument very easily that Breece Hall is the 101 just because there's so much volatility also with the quarterback position. And, obviously this week has been really good for some of those guys like Malik Willis in particular, where looks like he's getting into the top 10. He's probably gonna be a top 10 guy, but there's just a lot of volatility there and variance there. So if I had the 101, I'd feel fine, right? With a guy like Breece Hall. But again, if I had the 102 right now and you weren't in a super flex league, if I had the 102, I do think that if someone's valuing that 102 similarly to recent seasons, versus like the 109 or something, or the, where you throw in a Kenneth Walker in there too and whatnot. And you have, 7, 8 deep where you feel fairly good about what you're getting there. And if you can get more picks, if you can get more players out of a trade like that, I'm totally down to move down in that case, because I don't think there's a clear cut one. And to Ryan's point, what he was saying earlier, there aren't that many like obvious go-to landing spots either, outside of like the Green Bay, Kansas City thing. But again, they're later in the first, right? Like it's not like they're a Jamar Chase situation where you're associating with him with an up and coming quarterback, or even like a Jaylen Waddle situation where you're associating him with a decent enough quarterback. There's just not a lot of that going on in the front half of drafts. Whereas in the back half, you're gonna find spots that are. Dallas is interesting and stuff and such, right? Like you're gonna find spots where, if one of these wide receivers land on them, they're gonna elevate a lot within this draft class from an ADP standpoint.
Do you feel the same, Ryan, knowing there's just this giant crop of very good players?
I do. I'm just having like Clyde Edwards-Helaire flashbacks, right? Because we had these conversations with the running back class of 2020 that it was deep. And, of course, for most people, I think Taylor was their pre-draft RB1, but, it might've been Swift or it might've been whoever. And then we let that juicy landing spot impact us. So yes, it's obviously going to create a value gain for those players, but at the same time, we have to be careful. I know I fell for Clyde at 101 in one league, and it still hurts a little bit.
One more
still
question
hurts a lot, actually.
One more question for the both of you before you get out of here. Ryan, I want to start with you, and that is, let's say someone has at least one pick in the last round, second round of rookie drafts. Which receiver right now, perhaps which player right now even if this person is in a league with both of you, actually, which player would you make sure that individual does not leave that round without? The one player in later rounds you are definitely drafting this year, pre-draft right now.
There's a lot of good ones.
Name them all then. That's okay.
I think this class has taken a hit just in general, but I like the depth of the group. I mean, we've already talked about Sky Moore and Watson. They're likely second rounders in rookie drafts. As a biased Kentucky fan, I love Wan'Dale Robinson still. His value's taken a hit because of the 5'8" measurement from the combine, but I'm still targeting him. Tolbert is Jaylen Tolbert, 30 overall in our latest rookie ADP. So he's probably ultimately my one answer if I'm trying to nail it down. And also the guy going the latest that I'm most interested in.
Pressure's on you now, JJ.
I got a lot of guys that I'm interested in late. One guy that my model seems like a good bit is Khalil Shakir, who, had a good combine, likely play a slot role whenever he enters the league. But one of his comps in my model, he wasn't he didn't have production throughout his collegiate career the same way, but one of his comps was actually Cooper Kupp in the model. So, he looks pretty good. At the running back position, someone who seems like hasn't gotten talked up enough is Kevin Harris from South Carolina. He's a bigger bodied guy who comped fairly well to like a James Conner in my model, and he had really good sophomore production. So I'm a little bit intrigued by him. He's going to be a day 3 guy. So, he's just a dart throw above all else. And then I'll go back to wide receiver, and I haven't really started this train yet, but I'm going to get it going. All right. I'm going to get this thing going.
Here we go.
Slot guys are, from an analytical perspective, you often see like pure slot receivers not necessarily have the most like baller profiles or anything, because they do a lot of what they do at the NFL level and how they translate is more, footwork and route running based, right? Hunter Renfrow is a really good example of that, where, his production in college was not good at all. But he's a great route runner. And so it was easy to throw darts that way. I think the one guy in this class who could be like that, he's a little bit bigger and not necessarily, he's more productive as well, but it hasn't been talked about that much. What I've seen, at least within the Dynasty community, is Kyle Phillips from UCLA. He's someone who might have better draft capital than folks realize. I've seen him in mocks go day 2. If he finds a spot where there's an open vacancy in the slot, he can immediately play. And so, you could get some cheap production from him probably in like the 4th round of rookie drafts at this point.
Kyle Phillips is the name to write down for everyone listening. And also, JJ, this model of yours, I know there's a place people can go to subscribe for it.
Yeah. You can go check out the prospect guide, the late round prospect guide over on lateround.com. It's 138 pages of nerdiness. That's what I'll describe it.
Lateround.com, as he mentioned, I am a subscriber. And Ryan, tell everyone what you have going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, over at Dynasty League football, all kinds of stuff going on, mostly centered around this rookie class that we've been talking about today. And we've actually got a good deal right now for brand new subscribers. You can actually use code LATEROUND33 and get 33% off.
That was not planned, by the way. When both of you, I invited both of you. The double plug was not planned. But anyways, I appreciate you joining, gentlemen. Everyone listening, remember, this is a new era of the Most Accurate Podcast with 2 episodes per week during the off season. So please, your likes, rates, reviews, they all help the show, whether it's on podcast via iTunes, Spotify, or on YouTube. But until then, until next Monday, when the rest of the gang, Chris Allen, Jennifer Eakins, Brendan Niles, they're all back. We'll see you next time.